viewer of this channel for any length of time, you may recognise a few names when I talk about low-budget filmmakers. Rennie Perez, Scott Jeffrey, Perry Reginald Teo. Another one you might recognise is Charlie Steeds. He is a British filmmaker that tends to make lower-budget genre movies, but I have to say I always feel his movies, although low-budget, have a little bit more care in them than some other kind of low-budget filmmakers. I've genuinely liked most of his films. Now, Charlie Steeds isn't the director of this film, but he is the producer, and his production company, Dark Temple Pictures, is the production company behind this movie, Children of the Night. Now, there have been multiple movies called Children of the Night, confusingly, and all about vampires, so this is kind of like going to be a little bit confusing. This is a 2023 movie, actually directed and written by William Steed. Steeds, they're not related, I don't think, different spellings, but here you go. Now, on the surface of this, you might be thinking, yes, looks like a World War II Nazi versus vampire movie. And although that is true to a degree, it's actually more of a LGBT romance film than I would say anything else. It obviously just being set in World War II with Nazis and vampires. So, let's discuss what's it all about. It primarily focuses on two British soldiers. They are the last ones left of their unit after a fierce battle in occupied France during the tail end of World War II. And they happen across a young Frenchman called Louis, who is out fishing and hunting for food and stuff. One of the British soldiers is somewhat suspicious of him. The other one tends to be more easygoing and a little bit more friendly towards Louis. And here's our main character, Jim, played by an actor who kind of comes across as a Wish.com version of Tom Holland, but I have to say he does quite a charming performance nonetheless. And they are a disagreement what to do with Louis. One of them wants to kind of tie him up and take him prisoner. The other one just wants to kind of let him go. But one of the soldiers is actually injured, so they agree to go back to Louis' father's house to kind of hide from the Nazis and kind of recuperate. But Louis and his father might have a dark secret. They might actually be vampires. The question being, are they on the side of the Allies, or are they just as dangerous as the Nazis themselves? And is there a kind of an attraction between Jim, our main character, one of the British soldiers, and Louis, the younger out of these two vampires? What will happen? You will have to watch this movie and find out. So let us discuss. Now, as I've mentioned, Charlie Steeds is the producer of these movies, and I have to say, and it's true of this one as well, certainly in that case, the Steeds produced movies. Yes, they're low budget, but they always, I think, don't take the easiest route. They always kind of have a little bit extra and don't have the typical kind of like rehash storylines where you have a group of girls being chased by a killer in some type of house. The stories have a little bit more to it, a little bit more thought behind it, a little bit more narrative, and it's true of this one. I mean, there's a fair amount kind of going on for such a kind of a low budget. We have this period setting, set in occupied France. We have a kind of a sequence at the beginning of the movie, albeit very short, where we have this kind of World War II combat sequences. We've got Nazis, we've kind of got Nosferatu vampires. So there's a lot going on, and not to mention, really I would suggest the main thread of this movie, the actual attraction between British soldier Jim and Louis, the French guy they find in the woods. Now, of course, there has been some controversy about kind of the LGBT kind of stance during that kind of time, certainly in Western civilizations and cultures and stuff like that, and obviously the stance then was a little different than it is now. So it has that kind of that extra element to this movie. So there's a fair amount of ambition in this movie, it has to be said, with many kind of spinning plates being kind of like served to you at one time. So kudos to the filmmakers here for certainly having ambition and having not the generic kind of like cookie cutter storyline that so many kind of low budget movies tend to have. So what does it do well on a kind of a technical level? I have to say I do think some of the kind of the character work here is pretty good. I actually quite liked the actual kind of our main character of Jim. As I said, he very much comes across as a kind of a Tom Holland sort of style kind of actor and sort of character. I wonder if that was a deliberate choice, to be honest with you. But he's very personable. His character is a very likeable character, and it's easy for us as the audience to kind of root for him. And I quite liked his interactions with Louis, with his kind of like his comrade, this kind of this other British soldier, and the kind of the father, all of which are kind of a very kind of different sort of types of kind of relationships and things like that. So I thought the actual character work, I mean, the acting isn't the best. I won't lie. It's not terrible, but there are a few clunky moments. But I think the character work was pretty decent. Certainly from our main character, and then also the guy who plays Louis as well. I thought they did a good job here of making a kind of believable characters, albeit obviously in a kind of a low budget setting. It has an interesting kind of mythology in regards to its vampires. The vampires, when they kind of turn, are quite horrendous looking, and they're a little different to your garden variety vampires, I suppose. For example, they can go out in sunlight. They're just not as powerful in the sunlight as they are during the dark and things like that. So they kind of played around with the kind of the vampire mythology here. We learned that there's maybe a few hundred or so in Europe, so they're not all that plentiful. But it gives you an idea of this mythology that's kind of setting without having to sit there and over-explain and giving you huge exposition dumps. You get enough to kind of get the idea about what's happening. We also have the idea here that our British soldiers may be in big trouble, because not only obviously do we have these kind of vampires to deal with, who, I'll be honest with you, aren't necessarily going to have their best intentions at heart. But we've also got the added threat of the kind of the Nazis as well, and they seem to be cottoning on that there is also this kind of vampire threat out there as well, and kind of they're thinking about maybe we should try and harness this as a kind of a potentially biological weapon. So it has some great ideas in there, I think, for obviously again for a low budget movie. And if you're a kind of like someone who likes a romance, yes, there is a romance, and I would argue that actually is probably the best developed part of the movie. The movie is at its best, I would say, on a kind of artistic and technical level, when it's actually the quieter moments, when it's actually this kind of like this flirtation and an attraction between these kind of two characters. I actually think it does the best job. In actual fact, I would even say maybe the director here would have benefited from just having a straight drama, less so of the kind of the fantastical stuff, which I actually have to say is the weakest element of this movie. Despite the fact I like the world building in this film, and I think it does just enough to give you an idea of what's going on without having to kind of like, as I say, give you loads of exposition. The execution here, and I think a lot of this is down to budget, but we have to be honest and say we've got to judge this as a final product. The actual kind of execution of some of the more outlandish elements is on the poorer side. So let's talk about the vampires first, and then we'll come on to the Nazis. Okay, so the vampires, as I mentioned, are quite horrendous looking with big heavy makeup. I would have actually think it would have been a better idea to dial down on the makeup, because it looks like a huge unwieldy rubber mask. Maybe just have a little bit of prosthetics, face bumps and fangs and contact lenses. I don't think these kind of these masks really work at all. I get the idea they wanted to have this kind of Count Orlok, Nosferatu look, but it really looks quite clunky. And it's really not helped that a lot of these times, because of this mythology, the vampires are shown in broad daylight. They don't look good. They do not look good. And even, we have to look at the details here. And again, I think William Steele is a first-time director, I believe. They're wearing these kind of rubber hands, these like rubber claws, and you just see the kind of the ends of the claws like bending when they're grasping things and things like that. I mean, the attention to detail in regards to like the level of care is not quite there. I mean, I'm assuming that it's a relatively short shoot. They didn't have time for many takes. That's the assumption I'm making. But as such, you'll just notice these little kind of like little things here and there, little niggles. And I have to say, because this makeup is so bulky, the actors here, I think, really struggle to move around in these kind of very kind of like lumbersome kind of masks and things like that, and as such, when we see, for example, combat with these kind of things, it looks a little bit clunky and, well, clumsy, to be brutally honest. So I don't think the actual look of the vampires is particularly strong. I would have actually dialed it down a little bit, and I think it might have been more effective. Sometimes less really is more. And then we have to talk about the Nazis. It reminds me of that sketch, like, We're the Baddies. I mean, the Nazis here, I have to say, are quite poorly depicted. We have a kind of a siege at the end of the movie with this kind of group of Nazis, one of which is played by Charlie Steed's regular, I think it's Thomas Lenk, I want to say off the top of my head. And, I mean, they're like half costumed. One of them's got like a jacket and a black t-shirt underneath, and like, the costume isn't very good. For some reason we have some scenes where we have Nazis talking in German to each other, but at the end the group of Nazis are talking in English to each other. Like, why? Why is that inconsistent? Clearly because those actors can't speak German. Get different actors that can speak it, or just have it all one language or all the other. It doesn't make sense. And then we have this ridiculous kind of shootout scene where, you know, we have our protagonists using old blunderbusses versus kind of Nazis with World War II era machine guns and things like that. They're just going to stand there seeming to shoot at nothing and stuff like that. It's very, very kind of poorly handled. Yeah, I get it's low budget, but I just think that definitely could have been shot better, even with the budget that we've kind of got here. And then we have a few kind of like scenes with the Nazis earlier on. We get a little bit of like a rudimentary kind of CGI at the beginning with kind of the actual kind of more large scale kind of battle sequence and things like that. It's low budget. I'm a little more forgiving on stuff like that. I understand that obviously there's restrictions here, but there are things here that I do think could have been just a little bit, tightened up, and there could have been some choices made that I think is, even with the same budget that it's got, the movie could have been a little bit more kind of effective. As I've mentioned, some of the acting here I don't think is the strongest, and the dialogue seems a little clunky, and it just has a little bit of, and again this is maybe down to a budget. We may be taking place in the tail end of World War II, but it has a sort of modern feel to it, a modern look. I don't think it really sort of captures a genuine kind of like feel that it's taking place kind of, in that kind of time period. And again, I can accept maybe that obviously that is going to be down to a kind of a budget, a budgetary issue. So, as with a lot of Charlie Steed's movies, I think the ambition and the vision of this kind of movie, it maybe outstrips the resources, and certainly kind of, I think in this case, maybe the experience kind of behind the camera and the know-how about what to actually do, because I don't think this movie sort of comes together all that well, despite it having some really good ideas, some interesting story elements and some good character stuff. The execution, when it's put together on a technical level, on a kind of a narrative level, just don't quite work. But I've got to say, I am still impressed with the ideas and the ambition behind this one, and there is some entertainment to be had here. I just think it kind of probably sits more or less at an average kind of B movie. If you go into this expecting you're not looking at a finely crafted movie, but you're looking at kind of a little bit rough and ready, but has some good ideas. 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.